The brushed steel of the Fairmont Business Center's revolving doors whispered as Julian McCall stepped into the air-conditioned coolness of the lobby. Sunlight, refracted through the towering glass facade, painted geometric patterns on the polished marble floor. He inhaled, the faint scent of lemon-infused cleaning solution mixing with the richer aroma of coffee from the cafe tucked in the corner. Another Tuesday, another meeting. His briefcase felt heavy in his hand, the weight of the case files pressing against his palm a familiar reminder of the burden he carried. He glanced at his watch. 10:17 a.m. Right on schedule. Tara Bledsoe, perched behind the sleek reception desk, watched him. Her gaze, initially casual, sharpened. Something about the man, she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The way he scanned the lobby, his dark suit crisp against his skin. The way his hand gripped the briefcase, it all felt off. A prickle of unease ran down her spine. He wasn't smiling. Most people who came through these doors, even if they weren't exactly cheerful, at least offered a polite nod or a fleeting smile to acknowledge her presence. This manha hadn't even glanced her way. He just stood there, radiating an unnerving intensity. He made her feel watched. Even though she knew, logically, he wasn't looking at her, she still felt the weight of his gaze. It felt invasive. McCall, oblivious to the scrutiny, smoothed a non-existent crease from his jacket. The lobby's quiet hum, the click of heels on the marble, the muffled conversations from behind closed office doors, all faded into the background as he mentally reviewed the key points of his presentation. He needed to be sharp, concise, convincing. The stakes were high. He adjusted his tie, a nervous habit he'd never quite managed to break, and walked towards the directory, his mind already strategizing. Tara watched him move, her heart tapping a quick, uneven rhythm against her ribs. He wasn't looking at the directory like someone who knew where they were going. He was stalling. She'd seen it before. The way he kept glancing around, feigning interest in the building's artwork. The way he lingered just a little too long before pressing the button for the elevator, it all screamed suspicious. She swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. "You know that guy?" she whispered to her colleague, leaning closer, her voice tight with apprehension. Her colleague, engrossed in a spreadsheet, barely glanced up. "Which guy?" Tara gestured with her chin towards McCall, who was now waiting for the elevator. "Him. The one in the suit." Her colleague shrugged. "Nope. Never seen him before." That settled it. Tara's unease solidified into a cold knot of certainty. Something wasn't right. Better safe than sorry. She reached for the phone, her fingers trembling slightly. "Hey, we've got someone out front. Not sure what he's doing. Might want to check it out." McCall heard the faint murmur of voices behind him, but dismissed it as background noise. The elevator doors slid open, and he stepped inside, pressing the button for the 22nd floor. As the doors closed, he caught a glimpse of two uniformed police officers striding purposefully through the lobby. He didn't give them a second thought. He was late. Officers Denham and Reyes approached the reception desk, their expressions alert. Denham, a stocky man with a tightly drawn face, addressed Tara. "We got a call about a suspicious individual. Can you describe him?" Tara, flustered by their sudden appearance, stammered. He was just standing there, in a suit, dark skin, looked nervous." Denham exchanged a look with Reyes, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "Which way did he go?" "He just got on the elevator." Tara pointed towards the closed doors. 22nd floor. Denham nodded curtly. "Thanks." He and Reyes moved quickly towards the elevators, their hands hovering near their holsters. Reyes felt a twinge of unease. The description was vague, almost generic. A man in a suit, dark skin, nervous, could be anyone. But Denham's brisk pace and set jaw told her he'd already made up his mind. Inside the elevator, McCall felt the familiar lurch in his stomach as it ascended. He closed his eyes for a moment, steeling himself for the meeting ahead. The elevator doors opened onto the 22nd floor, and he stepped out, only to be met by the sight of two police officers waiting for him. His heart skipped a beat. What was this about? "Sir," Denham said, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Can we have a word with you?" McCall, his mind racing, forced himself to remain calm. "Is there a problem, officers? We received a report of a suspicious individual matching your description," Denham continued, his hand resting on his holster. McCall's brows furrowed. Suspicious? He felt a surge of anger, hot and prickly beneath his skin. Suspicious? "I'm here for a meeting." "Step aside, sir." Denham's voice hardened. "We need to ask you some questions." Reyes watched the exchange, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. The man's confusion seemed genuine. He held himself with a quiet dignity that didn't quite fit the profile of someone trying to evade the police. She glanced at Denham, whose face remained impassive. "I have a meeting in 5 minutes," McCall said, trying to keep his voice even. "I'm Special Agent Julian McCall, FBI." He reached for his ID. Denham's hand tightened on his holster. "FBI? We'll be the judge of that. Hands where we can see them." Before McCall could respond, a voice rang out from the elevator. "What's going on here?" Agent Jennifer Rhoda strode towards them, her expression a mixture of concern and authority. Her gaze swept over the scene, taking in the 2 officers, their hands hovering near their weapons, and McCall, his face tight with controlled anger. "Agent McCall," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Everything all right?" "Agent Rhodes," McCall replied, relief flooding through him. "These officers seem to think I'm suspicious." Rhodes turned to the officers, her eyes narrowed. "Officers, may I ask why you're detaining my agent?" Denham, momentarily flustered, stammered. "We received a report of a suspicious individual, matching his description." Rhodes's gaze hardened. "And what exactly was suspicious about his description?" Denham hesitated, glancing at Reyes, who remained silent. He was acting nervously. "He's about to go into a high-stakes meeting," Rhodes retorted, her voice laced with steel. "I'd be more concerned if he wasn't nervous. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do." The officers, their faces flushed, stepped aside. As Rhodes and McCall walked away, Reyes looked back at Denham, a question hanging unspoken between them. The air, still thick with tension, seemed to hum with the weight of unspoken words, the echoes of unconscious bias reverberating in the sterile silence of the 22nd floor. The sterile hum of the air conditioning continued its monotonous drone, a soundtrack to the echoing silence that had descended upon the lobby. Tara Bledsoe, her heart still thrumming a jittery rhythm against her ribs, watched the elevator doors slide shut, swallowing the man within its metallic maw. She'd done it. She'd called the police. A prickle of unease danced along her skin. Had she overreacted? The man had been well-dressed, articulate, but that unsettling intensity in his eyes. No. She'd done the right thing. Her duty was to protect the building, to ensure the safety of its occupants. This was protocol. This was safe. She exhaled, a shaky puff of air that barely disturbed the still, conditioned air. 2 uniformed officers strode into the lobby, their presence immediately changing the atmosphere. The clicking of their boots on the polished floor echoed with an authority Tara found both reassuring and slightly intimidating. Officer Travis Denham, his face set in a serious expression, scanned the area with a practiced eye, his hand instinctively hovering near his holster. His partner, Officer Paulina Reyes, followed closely behind, her gaze more observant, taking in the subtle details of the scene. Tara's slightly flustered appearance, the abandoned coffee cup on the low table, the lingering scent of expensive cologne. Denham approached the reception desk, his posture radiating an air of contained energy. He addressed Tara, his voice firm but polite. "We received a call about a suspicious individual." "Yes, officer," Tara replied, her voice still trembling slightly. He went up in the elevator. "Just a moment ago." Denham frowned. "Can you describe him?" "Tall African-American, dark suit." Tara hesitated, struggling to articulate the vague sense of unease the man had evoked. "He just seemed out of place." Reyes, who had been quietly observing Tara, exchanged a subtle glance with her partner. "Out of place how?" she prompted gently. Tara floundered, the words failing her. I can't explain it. He just didn't seem like he belonged here. The elevator doors opened with a soft ping, breaking the tense silence. Julian McCall stepped back into the lobby, his briefcase in hand. He hadn't noticed the officers yet, his mind still preoccupied with the upcoming meeting. He was reviewing the key points of his presentation, mentally rehearsing the arguments he anticipated encountering. He hadn't slept well the night before, the weight of the case pressing on him, a constant, dull ache behind his eyes. Denham and Reyes turned simultaneously towards the sound, their hands moving instinctively closer to their weapons. The description fit. Tall, African-American, dark suit. Denham felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal response to the perceived threat. Suspect apprehended. The thought flitted through his mind, a flicker of satisfaction. McCall finally registered the presence of the officers. A flicker of surprise, quickly masked by his usual composure, crossed his face. He recognized the uniforms, Arlington County Police. What were they doing here? A knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He knew this look, this subtle shift in their posture, the almost imperceptible tightening of their grips on their belts. He'd seen it before, reflected in the eyes of men who saw his skin first, his credentials second. "Sir, can we speak with you for a moment?" Denham's voice, though polite, carried an underlying current of tension. McCall paused, his briefcase still held loosely in his hand. "I'm with the Bureau," he replied, his voice calm and measured. "Just here for a scheduled meeting." He internally debated showing his credentials. Experience had taught him that sometimes the act itself could escalate a situation. He decided to wait, to gauge the officer's reaction. Denham exchanged another glance with Reyes. "FBI?" He felt a flicker of doubt, a tiny crack in the wall of certainty he'd built around the situation. He hadn't expected this. Reyes' expression was more thoughtful, hint of questioning in her eyes. "Which bureau?" Denham asked, the words clipped, a challenge hanging in the air. McCall's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He could feel the familiar burn of frustration rising in his chest. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. This wasn't the time or the place. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation," he replied, his tone even, each word carefully enunciated. He decided to show his credentials. This charade was going nowhere. He reached for his wallet, his movements deliberate, slow. Denham watched his every move, his hand still hovering near his holster. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the man's calm demeanor with the receptionist's vague accusations. Something didn't add up. Reyes noticed the subtle shift in her partner's stance, the slight easing of tension in his shoulders. She could see the wheels turning behind his eyes, the doubt beginning to creep in. She herself was feeling increasingly uneasy about the situation. The man's composure, his measured responses, it didn't fit the profile of someone trying to evade the police. Just as McCall retrieved his badge, a brisk, authoritative voice cut through the tense atmosphere. "Agent McCall? Everything all right here?" A woman, impeccably dressed in a sharp pantsuit, strode into the lobby, her gaze sweeping over the scene. Jennifer Rodas, McCall's supervisor, exuded an aura of command that instantly shifted the balance of power. She had been delayed in traffic and had decided to meet McCall directly at the business center. McCall turned towards the sound of her voice, a wave of relief washing over him. "Agent Rodas, just a slight misunderstanding." Rodas' gaze shifted to the officers, her expression hardening. "Officers, can I help you?" Denham, caught off guard, stammered. "We received a call about a suspicious individual matching Agent McCall's description." Rodas raised an eyebrow, her gaze piercing. "Suspicious?" "Agent McCall is a decorated agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I suggest you clarify your definition of suspicious with the person who made the report." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusation. Reyes shifted uncomfortably, her gaze fixed on the floor. She felt a flush of shame creep up her neck. The pieces clicked into place, the receptionist's vague description, Her partner's quick judgment, it was a scenario she'd seen play out before. A familiar script of unconscious bias. Denham's face flushed crimson. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He felt a knot of shame tighten in his stomach. He had jumped to conclusions, allowing his preconceived notions to cloud his judgment. Rhodas turned back to McCall, her voice softening. "Let's go, Julian. We're late." They walked towards the elevators, leaving the two officers standing in the echoing silence of the lobby. The hum of the air conditioning seemed to amplify the weight of the unspoken words, the unspoken truths hanging heavy in the air. Reyes looked at her partner, her expression a mixture of disappointment and resignation. "Travis?" she began, her voice low. "We need to talk." Denham stared at the closed elevator doors, his mind replaying the events of the last few minutes. He felt a profound sense of unease, a gnawing awareness of his own flawed perception. The receptionist's words, his own assumptions. He had failed to see the man, only the color of his skin. The cool air of the business center lobby, a stark contrast to the humid Virginia afternoon, did little to alleviate the rising heat in Julian McCall's chest. The polished marble floor reflected the fluorescent lights, creating a sterile sheen that mirrored the sterility of the situation. He stood with his back against the wall, a messenger bag slung over his shoulder, the weight of it suddenly feeling oppressive. His phone call had been cut short by the arrival of two Arlington County police officers, their presence casting a palpable tension over the previously quiet lobby. He could feel the receptionist's gaze, sharp and accusatory, burning into his back. "This is absurd," he thought, the words echoing in the hollow space of his mind. "Absolutely absurd. Sir, could you step away from the wall, please?" Officer Denham's voice was tight, laced with an undercurrent of suspicion that grated on McCall's nerves. Denham's hand hovered near his holster, a gesture that didn't escape McCall's notice. He complied, pushing himself off the wall, his movements slow and deliberate. The last thing he needed was to give them any reason to escalate the situation. Just cooperate, he told himself, the internal mantra a calming force against the rising tide of frustration. "It's a misunderstanding. It'll be cleared up soon. And keep your hands where we can see them," Officer Reyes added, her voice softer than her partner's, yet still carrying a note of caution. McCall held his hands up, palms open, a gesture of compliance that felt strangely demeaning. He watched as the two officers exchanged a look, a silent communication passing between them. Denham's expression remained rigid, while Reyes's brow furrowed slightly, a hint of uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "They're buying into her story," McCall realized, his stomach clenching with a mixture of anger and resignation. The receptionist's whispered accusations had painted him as a potential threat, a narrative he was now forced to dismantle. "I'm an FBI agent," he stated calmly, his voice steady despite the turmoil brewing within. "I'm here for a meeting. Sir, we need you to sit on the floor, hands where we can see them," Denham repeated, his tone unwavering. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of authority. A wave of disbelief washed over McCall. Sit on the floor? Like a common criminal? The thought sparked a flicker of defiance within him, a refusal to be reduced to a stereotype. But he quickly tamped it down. Escalating the situation would only make things worse. "I'm reaching for my credentials," McCall said, his voice measured. "They're in my bag." "Can you set the bag down and open it slowly?" Reyes asked, her gaze fixed on his hands. There was a subtle shift in her demeanor, a slight softening of her stance. McCall hesitated for a moment, the weight of the bag suddenly amplified, a symbol of the suspicion he carried. He slowly lowered it to the floor, his movements precise and controlled. He unzipped the bag, his fingers fumbling slightly, a betrayal of the nerves he was trying so hard to suppress. He could feel their eyes on him, scrutinizing his every move, and the pressure mounted. He pulled out his wallet, flipping it open to reveal his badge. "Here," he said, extending it towards Reyes. Reyes took the badge, her eyes scanning it carefully. A flicker of recognition crossed her face, followed by a subtle change in her posture. The rigid tension seemed to ease slightly. She glanced at Denham, a silent conversation passing between them once more. Denham's face remained impassive, his eyes narrowed in skepticism. He took the badge from Reyes, his fingers brushing against hers, the contact brief and impersonal. He examined it with a meticulousness that bordered on obsessive, as if searching for some hidden flaw, some evidence of forgery. The silence stretched, each tick of the lobby clock amplifying the tension. McCall could feel the receptionist's gaze, no longer sharp, but now tinged with a strange mixture of curiosity and apprehension. He imagined the questions racing through her mind, the realization dawning that she had made a mistake, a potentially grave one. Denham finally handed the badge back to Reyes, who then returned it to McCall. "Agent McCall," she said, her voice now devoid of the earlier caution, replaced by a newfound formality. "We apologize for the inconvenience." McCall took the badge, his fingers closing around it, the cool metal a tangible reminder of his identity, of the authority he held. He slipped it back into his wallet, his movements deliberate, each action a quiet assertion of his composure. He could feel the remnants of the adrenaline coursing through his veins, the aftershocks of the unwarranted suspicion. Just as he was about to retrieve his bag, a brisk, authoritative voice cut through the tense atmosphere. "What's going on here?" Agent Jennifer Rodas strode into the lobby, her presence commanding immediate attention. Her sharp gaze swept across the scene, taking in the officers, McCall, and the now pale receptionist. She exuded an aura of power, of someone accustomed to being in control. "Agent McCall?" She addressed him directly, her voice laced with concern. "Is everything all right?" McCall straightened, the weight of the situation shifting slightly. He had been alone, facing the unwarranted suspicion of two officers, but now he had backup, a reminder that he was not isolated in this experience. "Agent Rodas," he replied, his voice regaining its usual calm. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Rodas's gaze shifted to the officers, her expression hardening. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated, her tone laced with steel. "Care to explain?" The unfolding events, the subtle shift in power dynamics, played out in front of McCall like a slow-motion film. He watched as Denham stammered through an explanation, his earlier confidence replaced by a nervous hesitancy. Reyes remained silent, her gaze fixed on the floor, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Rodas listened, her expression unchanging, her eyes dissecting their every word. When they finished, she turned back to McCall, her gaze softening slightly. "Julian, let's go," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "We're late for the meeting." As they walked towards the elevators, McCall glanced back at the two officers, their figures small and insignificant in the spacious lobby. The image lingered in his mind, a stark reminder of the casual prejudice he had just encountered, a prejudice rooted in assumptions and fueled by fear. He knew this incident was not an isolated event, that it was part of a larger pattern, a systemic issue that ran deep within the fabric of society. The quiet hum of the elevator seemed to amplify the silence between him and Rodas, a silence pregnant with unspoken words, with the weight of an experience shared but not yet fully processed. The elevator doors parted with a soft hiss, revealing a woman whose presence seemed to reshape the air in the lobby. Jennifer Rodas, her tailored suit as sharp as her gaze, took in the tableau before her. McCall, her agent, kneeling on the polished floor, two uniformed officers flanking him like wary sentinels. A knot tightened in her stomach. Not this, not again. The thought echoed the dull ache of 1,000 similar injustices witnessed, a weariness that settled deep in her bones. Her stride was brisk, purposeful, each click of her heels a punctuation mark in the sudden, tense silence. "What the hell is going on?" Her voice, though level, carried an undercurrent of steel. The officer straightened, Denham's hand instinctively moving towards his belt. Rhea's eyes darted between Rodas's face and McCall, a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze. This woman, with her air of command and the barely concealed fury in her eyes, was clearly not someone to be trifled with. Reyes felt a prickle of unease, a subtle shift in the balance of power she hadn't anticipated. Something isn't right, she thought, the feeling nagging at the edge of her awareness. Denham, however, felt a surge of irritation. This interruption, this challenge to his authority, grated on his nerves. He'd been following procedure, responding to a call for assistance. This woman, whoever she was disrupting the process. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain, to justify. But Rhodas didn't give him the chance. Her eyes, like glacial ice, fixed on Denham. "This man," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "is Special Agent Julian McCall. He's here with my full authority." "Is he on the floor?" Each word was a hammer blow, shattering the fragile facade of control Denham had been clinging to. He swallowed, the carefully constructed narrative of justifiable action crumbling under the weight of her scrutiny. He glanced at McCall, still kneeling, a picture of quiet dignity amidst the absurdity of the situation. Doubt, like a corrosive acid, began to eat away at his certainty. Reyes felt a cold dread creeping up her spine. The woman's words hung in the air, heavy with implication. "Special Agent?" She looked at McCall again, really looked and saw not a suspect, but a man unjustly detained. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, forming a picture far less clear-cut than the one Denham had painted. She felt a flush of shame warming her cheeks. Had she been so quick to judge, so willing to accept a biased narrative? "Ma'am," Reyes stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were told he was behaving strangely. Security asked us to check it out." The words felt hollow even to her own ears. She could see the skepticism etched on Rhodas's face, the silent accusation in her unwavering gaze. Rhodas's gaze swept over Reyes, lingering for a moment on the barely perceptible tremor in her hand. She saw the dawning realization, the flicker of regret in the young officer's eyes. At least one of them has a conscience, she thought, the icy knot in her stomach loosening just a fraction. Then, Rhodas turned her attention back to Denham, her eyes burning with an intensity that made him flinch. "Strangely?" she echoed, her voice laced with sarcasm. "And what, pray tell, constituted this strange behavior?" She stepped closer, the sheer force of her presence shrinking the space between them. Denham could feel the heat of her anger, the weight of her unspoken condemnation. He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her eyes. He could feel the blood draining from his face, the carefully constructed justification dissolving into a jumble of half-formed thoughts. The lobby, moments ago buzzing with the low hum of business, was now filled with a suffocating silence. Tara Bledsoe, huddled behind her desk, watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of dread. The assured confidence she'd felt earlier had evaporated, replaced by a nauseating mix of fear and regret. She'd been so certain, so quick to judge. Now, the consequences of her actions were laid bare, a stark and unforgiving tableau of injustice. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing she could disappear, rewind the clock, undo what she'd done. The muffled sound of Rhodas's voice, sharp and accusatory, pierced through her self-imposed darkness. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was only the beginning. McCall, still kneeling, watched the exchange with a detached calmness that belied the turmoil within. He'd been through this before, the casual racism, the unwarranted suspicion, the humiliating indignity of being treated like a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. The familiar wave of weariness washed over him, a heavy cloak of resignation. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, steeling himself for the inevitable apologies, the hollow assurances that it was all a misunderstanding. He knew, with a certainty born of experience, that nothing would really change. But he also knew that he couldn't afford to lose his composure. Not here, not now. He had a job to do, a meeting to attend. He would not let their prejudice derail him. Rhodas's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the silence. "Officer Denham," she said, her tone brooking no argument, "I suggest you help Agent McCall to his feet, and then perhaps you can explain to me in detail precisely what transpired here." Her words hung in the air, a promise of accountability, a glimmer of hope in the oppressive weight of the moment. The subtle shift in the power dynamic was complete. The officers, stripped of their authority, were now the ones under scrutiny. And in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, a silent question echoed in the stillness of the lobby. How many other Julian McCalls were out there, silently enduring the indignities of unconscious bias, their stories untold, their voices unheard? The tension, thick and suffocating only moments ago, began to dissipate like smoke in a crosswind. The pressure on McCall's wrists eased, the cold steel cuffs clicking open. He rubbed the raw skin, the phantom weight lingering. He hadn't flinched, hadn't uttered a word beyond the necessary, but a simmering anger coiled in his gut. 7 minutes. 7 minutes he'd sat there, an exhibit in his own life, while they dissected him with their stares. 7 minutes wasted, 7 minutes stolen. He could have been upstairs, already delving into the intricacies of the case. He glanced at Rhodas, her face a mask of controlled fury. A small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the shared indignation. Officer Denham stood frozen, the blood draining from his face as Agent Rhodas's words hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. So you saw a black man standing in a lobby with a Bluetooth in his ear, and the immediate next move was to put him on the ground? The fluorescent lights of the lobby seemed to hum louder, amplifying the silence that followed. He swallowed hard, the knot in his throat constricting his airway. He'd seen it 1,000 times, this look, this accusation, usually from the other side. Now he was the target. His mind raced, scrambling for justification, for a defense against the unspoken indictment. He'd followed procedure, hadn't he? The receptionist had been scared, insistent. The man McCall had been uncooperative. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Uncooperative. What did that even mean? Not immediately subservient. He risked a glance at Reyes, her expression unreadable. Had she seen it too, the insidious creep of prejudice coloring his judgment? Reyes shifted her weight, the subtle movement betraying the turmoil beneath her stoic facade. She'd felt it too, that initial prickle of unease radiating from Denham. It had been subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to set the tone, to escalate the situation. The receptionist's frantic whisper, the man's calm demeanor juxtaposed against Denham's rigid posture, it had all coalesced into a perfect storm of misinterpretation. She'd followed Denham's lead as she'd been trained to do, but a nagging doubt had gnawed at her. Now, witnessing the raw humiliation etched on McCall's face, the doubt blossomed into a sickening certainty. They'd messed up, royally. She met Rhodas's gaze, the older woman's eyes sharp and knowing. There was no escape, no justification. The silence stretched, each tick of the lobby clock a hammer blow against her conscience. 7 minutes. McCall's voice cut through the tense quiet, low and resonant. That's how long I sat there while they stared at me like I might blow up the building. He met Denham's gaze, his own unwavering. He saw the flicker of something in the officer's eyes, shame, regret. He wasn't sure, and frankly, he didn't care. The damage was done. He adjusted his suit jacket, the small movement a deliberate act of reclaiming his dignity. The sting of the cuffs remained, a physical reminder of the casual injustice he'd just endured. Rhodas watched the interplay between McCall and Denham, her gaze unwavering. She'd seen this scenario play out too many times, the subtle yet devastating consequences of implicit bias. She took a step closer to Denham, her voice dropping to a near whisper, laced with a chilling intensity. You applied your name was Travis Denham. The words struck Denham like a physical blow. His breath hitched. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. His dream. He'd poured his heart and soul into that application, meticulously crafting his responses, highlighting his dedication, his keen observation skills. He'd imagined himself working alongside the best, dissecting criminal minds, bringing justice to victims. Now, the irony was a bitter pill to swallow. He'd been so focused on profiling criminals, on identifying patterns of behavior, that he'd failed to recognize his own. The receptionist's fear, amplified by his own preconceived notions, had blinded him. He'd become the very thing he'd sworn to fight against. He looked at McCall, seeing him not as a suspect, but as a fellow agent, a victim of a system riddled with flaws. The shame burned, hot and searing. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, but the words caught in his throat. Reyes watched Denham's face crumple, the realization dawning in his eyes. She'd known about his application to the BAU, had even helped him proofread his essays. She felt a pang of empathy for him, even as she wrestled with her own complicity. She hadn't initiated the confrontation, but she hadn't stopped it either. She'd allowed the current to carry her along, passively accepting Denham's lead. This incident, this stark revelation of their collective failure, had cracked the veneer of their professional detachment, exposing the raw, uncomfortable truth beneath. The silence in the lobby pressed down on them, heavy with unspoken accusations and the weight of their own self-reproach. In the background, Tara Bledsoe, the receptionist, shrank against the wall, her face ashen. The initial surge of self-righteousness had evaporated, replaced by a chilling wave of guilt. She'd been so certain, so convinced of the threat. The Bluetooth, the briefcase, the way he looked. Now, she saw the scene through a different lens, the lens of Agent Rotus's scathing words. She judged a man based on the color of his skin, on her own ingrained prejudices. Her fear, her misplaced vigilance, had set in motion a chain of events with devastating consequences. The shame was a physical ache, a knot tightening in her chest. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the patterned wallpaper and become invisible. The sterile air of the business center lobby seemed to crackle with the unspoken. The aftermath of the confrontation hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that clung to each person present. The incident, brief yet profound, had left an indelible mark, forcing a quiet reflection on the insidious nature of bias and the far-reaching consequences of unchecked assumptions. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights, a stark reminder of the harsh reality that had unfolded beneath their artificial glow. The glass doors of the business center slid shut behind them, sealing off the sterile, air-conditioned lobby from the humid Virginia afternoon. Julian McCall drew a deep breath, the heavy air feeling oddly liberating against his skin. He hadn't realized how tense he'd become until he stepped outside, the weight of the encounter pressing down on him like a physical burden. He could feel the phantom pressure of Denham's hand on his arm, a lingering reminder of the unwarranted detention. This is what it feels like, he thought, the realization hitting him with a cold clarity. To be judged not by who you are, but by what you represent to someone else. Jennifer Rotus, his supervisor, stood beside him, her expression grim. "I'll be filing a formal complaint," she said, her voice low but firm. "This can't go unaddressed." Her words were clipped, precise, reflecting the controlled fury simmering beneath the surface. He knew she was more upset on his behalf than for herself. Julian nodded, rubbing the back of his neck, a gesture he realized he'd been repeating throughout the ordeal. "Thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate that." He meant it. Her presence had been a lifeline, a validation that he wasn't imagining the injustice. But what if she hadn't been there? The thought prickled at him. What if I was just another black man in a suit, mistaken for a threat? A shadow fell over them. Officer Reyes stood there, her expression a complex mix of regret and uncertainty. "Agent McCall," she began, her voice hesitant. "Can I have a word?" Julian glanced at Jennifer, who gave a subtle nod of encouragement. He turned back to Reyes, his face unreadable. What more could she possibly have to say? He wondered, a flicker of resentment sparking within him. Reyes shifted her weight, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond Julian's shoulder. "My partner," she trailed off, struggling to find the right words. "He wants to talk to you." Julian's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Denham? Wants to talk? After what just happened?" A surge of anger threatened to break through his carefully constructed composure. He wanted to walk away, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the man who had just treated him like a criminal. But something held him back. A flicker of curiosity, perhaps, or maybe a sliver of hope that some good could come from this mess. "Where is he?" he asked, his voice flat. Reyes gestured towards the parking lot, where Denham stood near their patrol car, his back to them. His shoulders were slumped, his posture radiating a dejection that was almost palpable. Reyes met Julian's gaze. "I didn't ask why. I didn't challenge my partner. I just watched." Her voice was barely a whisper, laced with self-reproach. "I'm not proud of that." Julian's gaze softened slightly. He saw the genuine remorse in her eyes, the dawning awareness of her own complicity. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her confession. Then, he turned and walked towards Denham, leaving Jennifer and Reyes standing together in the afternoon heat. As he approached, Denham turned, his face etched with a mixture of shame and apprehension. He looked older, the youthful bravado he'd displayed in the lobby replaced by a weariness that seemed to seep from his very pores. "Agent McCall," he began, his voice strained. I messed up." Julian stopped a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. He studied Denham's face, searching for any hint of insincerity. Is this genuine remorse, or just damage control? He remained silent, waiting for Denham to continue. "I let my assumptions, my prejudices cloud my judgment," Denham stammered, avoiding Julian's gaze. He fumbled with the brim of his cap, his fingers nervously tracing the outline. "The receptionist, her description, He trailed off again, his voice choked with emotion. Julian's internal monologue was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He wanted to lash out, to unleash the anger that was still simmering beneath the surface. But he saw something in Denham's eyes, a vulnerability that disarmed him. He saw a man grappling with the uncomfortable truth of his own bias, a man struggling to reconcile his actions with his perceived sense of justice. "This isn't about protecting your ego," Julian said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about whether you're willing to learn something uncomfortable, something that challenges your worldview." Denham finally met Julian's gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and a desperate plea for understanding. "I want to learn," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to be that guy." Julian held his gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. The air crackled with unspoken words, with the weight of the moment. Can he change? Julian wondered, a flicker of doubt lingering in his mind. Can anyone truly change? Finally, he broke the silence. "I want you to remember something," he said, his voice low and steady. "The only difference between you and me in that lobby was that I knew who I was. You didn't know who I was. You only saw what you expected to see." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The interview's still on, but I won't be the one doing all the talking." He turned to leave, a sense of weariness settling over him. He didn't know if Denham would truly learn from this experience, but he hoped, for both their sakes, that he would. As he walked towards Jennifer, he glanced back at Denham, who stood motionless, staring at the ground. The image of the young officer, grappling with the uncomfortable truth of his own bias, would stay with him, a stark reminder of the insidious nature of prejudice and the long, hard road towards true understanding. The glass doors of the business center slid shut behind him, the cool, conditioned air replaced by the humid Virginia summer. Julian McCall inhaled deeply, the scent of exhaust fumes and hot asphalt a stark contrast to the sterile lobby he'd just escaped. He wasn't free of the tightness in his chest, the phantom pressure of Denham's hand on his arm still lingering. He ran a hand over his suit jacket, smoothing non-existent wrinkles, the gesture a futile attempt to erase the feeling of violation. He had a meeting to debrief about, a case to pursue. Yet his mind remained tethered to the lobby, to the subtle shift in Reyes's eyes, the stubborn set of Denham's jaw. Had he been angrier, the situation could have escalated. The thought sent a ripple of unease through him. He'd chosen composure, professionalism, not because he wasn't furious, but because experience had taught him restraint was often the most effective weapon. He had a career to protect, a life he wouldn't let be defined by the prejudices of others. He reached his car, the sleek black sedan a symbol of his hard-won success, a tangible representation of the barriers he'd broken. He unlocked it, the beep a small, sharp sound in the quiet parking lot, and was about to slide inside when he heard the crunch of gravel behind him. He turned, his body tensing involuntarily, ready for another confrontation. It was Denham. He stood a few feet away, his uniform slightly rumpled, his face etched with a conflict Julian recognized, a war waging within the man's own conscience. There was a strange sense of déjà vu, like a rewind of the morning's events. Only this time, the air wasn't thick with suspicion, but with something akin to regret. Julian waited, his hand still resting on the car door, his gaze steady. He wouldn't make the first move. He wouldn't offer an olive branch he wasn't sure Denham deserved. Agent McCall. Denham's voice was low, almost hesitant. He shifted his weight, the movement conveying an unease that hadn't been present before. Two wanted to apologize. The words seemed to catch in his throat. Julian could almost see the internal battle, the pride wrestling with the dawning realization. Julian's internal voice was cynical. An apology? After the humiliation, the blatant disregard for his credentials, a simple sorry, was supposed to erase it all? He remained silent, his expression unreadable. He wanted more than an apology, he wanted understanding. Denham seemed to interpret his silence correctly. He took a step closer, his hands clasped in front of him, his gaze fixed on the asphalt. Two reviewed the security footage, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The receptionist Chesh got it wrong. Julian's jaw tightened. He knew that. He'd known it from the moment he'd seen the fear in the woman's eyes, the way she'd clutched her phone like a lifeline. He'd seen the assumptions forming in her mind, fueled by his skin color, his suit, his presence in a predominantly white business center. She saw a black man, Julian finally said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. And she saw a threat. Denham winced. He met Julian's gaze, a flicker of shame in his eyes. Two should have questioned her more. I should have seen. The use of that word, seen, resonated with Julian. It wasn't just about seeing what was in front of you. It was about seeing beyond the surface, beyond the preconceived notions that clouded judgment. He reached into his briefcase, retrieving a manila folder. He held it out to Denham. "This is for you," he said, his voice still controlled, yet laced with a hint of something else, something that bordered on weariness. Denham hesitated, his eyes questioning. "What is it?" "Preparation for your interview with the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility," Julian replied. "Agent Rodas thought you might find it helpful." Denham's face paled. He took the folder, his fingers brushing against Julian's. The contact was brief, yet charged with unspoken understanding. He looked down at the folder, the weight of its contents heavy in his hands. Denham swallowed, his throat dry. I didn't mean." Julian cut him off. "Next time you walk into a room," he said, his voice soft yet firm, "don't just see what's there. Ask yourself what you might be missing." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Denham's eyes met his, a flicker of something akin to comprehension dawning within them. "This morning," Denham said, his voice barely a whisper, "I thought I knew who I was. A good cop. Fair. Just now," he paused, his gaze drifting towards the ground. "Now, I think maybe I've just been lucky that no one ever challenged that belief." Julian nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. He turned back to his car, the weight of the morning beginning to lift, replaced by a sliver of hope, a fragile optimism that perhaps, just perhaps, something positive could emerge from this unpleasant encounter. He slid into the driver's seat, the leather cool against his skin, and started the engine. As he pulled away, he glanced back at Denham, still standing in the parking lot, the manila folder clutched in his hand, his figure small against the backdrop of the imposing business center. The image lingered in Julian's mind, a stark reminder of the unseen forces that shaped perceptions, the subtle biases that could escalate into damaging confrontations. The encounter had left an indelible mark, a subtle shift in both their worlds, a reminder that true justice wasn't just about enforcing the law, but about confronting the hidden prejudices that lay within. The quiet hum of the engine filled the car, a steady rhythm against the silence of the afternoon, a silence pregnant with the unspoken weight of what had transpired, and the long road ahead towards understanding.